Hi everyone, welcome back to week 3 of the Moon Diamond Sewalong that I'm doing in conjunction with Make Modern magazine. My pattern is in this issue of Make Modern magazine. There's links in the caption below if you haven't managed to grab that issue or you have a subscription or something. So check them out. Fantastic magazine, has not just quilt patterns but fantastic articles on all different types of things about quilting. So go ahead and check it out. Now, my pattern, obviously, Moon Diamond, this is one version of it. I'm making another along with you on this sew along. And week 3, this week, is all about foundation paper piecing. So I'm going to show you how to make our cute little block. Now, as I said last week and the week before, I'm using sort of a graduated colours throughout the block. So these are my main feature prints, but I'm using this lovely sort of graduated solids throughout the background. And as you can see here, I sort of use slightly more colourful versions here. These are much more pastels and things, so it's making the feature prints really stand out. So we are going to go and talk and show you how to do foundation paper piecing. Nice, easy one, don't worry. And this week we're talking all about foundation paper piecing and how to do it and all my little tips and tricks. Now, different people do foundation paper piecing different ways. This one is a fairly simple one, so even if you do things slightly different to how I do it, it's still going to be a nice, easy one to do. So let's get stuck into it. So the very first thing I like to do when I get a new template for my foundation paper piecing is actually to fold along the lines that we're going to be sewing along. This just makes it a little bit easier in one of the steps that we get to. And as I talked to you last week, I've got this really cool add an eighth ruler, which has this lovely sort of pointed edge. And that's what I've been using to fold my lines back. But a good old fashioned, 30 centimetre ruler that you used to get at school, or however many inches that is, works just as well. It just means that sort of a flat edge is just that little bit easier than perhaps using a very square sort of quilting kind of ruler edge. Just makes it a little bit easier. And all I do is put the ruler on the line and I just come in and run my little fingernail along there. I'm not folding it all the way back. I'm just literally folding it sort of at a 90 degrees. And I'm just going to come and do all of the lines that we're going to sew on. Okay. So I can put my rulers away for a moment. So there we've got our sort of, hopefully you can see them, the little folds, and we're ready to go. So we need to then get the fabrics that we're going to be putting onto this block, and it is going to be exactly the same as this one that I've already done. So we're going to need our central piece, we're going to need 2 of the triangles for the bottom, 2 of the triangles for the top, and 4 of my border strips. Okay, so that's really all we need. So I'm going to keep these sort of in the right order because, as you can see, this colour is slightly different to that colour, and that's the same way throughout the pattern. Those are all the same, so they can just sit there. And we are going to start with the very one in the middle, A1. Now, probably the most confusing part of foundation paper piecing that people find is that you don't work from the printed side of the paper. You actually work from the back of the paper. And this is where something like my little light box that I've got here can really help, because it helps to see, and in fact it can be a bit easier to see without that on. You can see where the lines are a bit easier. So the size that we're cutting our central fussy cut diamond piece basically kind of fits in that big diamond, but it is a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So what I find, depending on the foundation paper piecing that I'm doing, I either pin this piece here, and with a piece this size, you would definitely want to do at least 2 pins, or you can pop a little bit of glue, and I've just got a little bit of glue stick. You don't need much. I just sort of put 4 little bits just so that it's going to hold it in the right spot when we're going to do some trimming in a second, and then we're going to take it to the sewing machine. So literally just 4 little dabs of glue. Won't make it too hard to pull the papers out later. So the first thing I like to do is decide which section I'm going to do. Now, according to the numbers, it should be this corner, and then that corner, and then this corner, and this corner. But the beauty of this quite simple foundation paper piecing means that we could actually do these 2 sides at the same time, and then those 2 sides, without having to perhaps get up and go to your ironing board and pressing and cutting and things like that. Now, as you can see, I've got my cute little setup right next to my sewing machine. My sewing machine's just over here. So I can actually use my light box. I can pull my little cutting board back onto my light box so I can do some trimming. And I've got my little iron here. But I also do have one of these cool little seam rollers. So, if you can't quite have your iron set up easily, one of these seam rollers can be really handy as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is decide, okay, I'm going to do this side. So that's this side. And what I'm going to do is just fold back that fold. Either grab my add 1/4 ruler or just a normal quilting ruler that's got a sort of 1/4 of a line marked, and I just line that 1/4 of an inch line up with the fold of the paper. Grab my rotary cutter and just trim off that little bit. Because that means that this is now 1/4 of an inch past that line that we're going to sew on. It means that we can go and grab our little border piece, and we can actually easily line it up with the edge of that fabric, making sure it goes over a bit in both ends. And again, I would suggest doing a little bit of a pin, because we're going to be turning it over to sew on it, to sew that line. Keeping your pins away from where your sew line is, so your sewing machine's not going to get in the road. We're going to then turn it over and go to the sewing machine, and we're actually going to sew on this line. We can go a little bit past that, the end, or the start and the end of that line. It's not going to matter when we come to this next one. We might just rip the paper a little bit to get past that extra bit. But we want to make sure. Now, I have a locking stitch on my sewing machine, so I actually do a locking stitch here and a little locking stitch there. One other thing, of course, on your sewing machine, make sure that you've decreased your stitch length. I sew with a 1.5 for foundation paper piecing. So I'm just going to come over here. I know it's off screen for you. Do my little locking stitch. And I've actually sewn that seam. You might be able to see it on that side. So I'm just going to take my little pins off and we can fold that back. Now, as I said, you can either do it with a little seam roller, or, as I've got my cute little Aliso Pro Mini set up right next to me, I can just press that nice and easily. And now we're following the numbers, so we've done our A1 to A2. We're now going to do our A2 to A3. But again, I like to trim this seam allowance first. So I'm going to then fold back on that second bit that we folded. I'm going to get my ruler, and I'm just going to trim 1/4 of an inch away, especially if I'm on there. I'm going to trim 1/4 of an inch away from that fold line. So now I can grab my light blue triangle, and I'm going to again line up those raw edges, making sure that it's centered and you've got a little bit of hang over both ends. I'm going to pop 2 little pins. The reason for 2 pins, I mean, you can get away with 1 on a smaller piece of fabric, but with 2 pins, it's less likely to wriggle. So I'm going to pick it up and turn it over, and we're going to be sewing on this next line, which is between the A2 and the A3. And I'm actually going to start out past the seam allowance. The seam allowance is the little dotted line on the outside. The solid line is where the block will finish when you've sewn it in. So I want to start my sewing out here past the seam allowance and go all the way across and past the seam allowance again. And there, I've done that seam. I can pull my pins out and I can fold it back. And again, either use my little seam roller or pop it onto my pressing mat and press it back. Just going to move that out of the way so that you can see things a bit better. And you'll see, hopefully, you'll see that the fabric triangle has been folded back and it covers all of that out to the seam allowance. So we'll be able to trim this block in the end and it'll be trimmed sort of about there. So you can see that it's got lots of space outside, which is what we want. We want that fabric to cover that entire piece, including the seam allowance. Okay, so now I am going to go and do the seam on the opposite side. Going to fold that back, grab my cutting mat back again. Trim my seam allowance. Grab my little border fabric, right sides together, raw edges together, pin, pin and pin. I'm coming back and I'm going to do my sewing along this line this time. Sewn that seam, I can take my pins out and I can press it back. Now I'm going to fold this paper back and I'm going to trim that seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch past the fold. And now the opposite corner of this is actually the slightly greenier blue. It's very hard to see on camera, I'm sure, the difference, but there is a slight difference in my gradient. And I'm going to put right sides together, raw edges together. And pin. Take my pins out. Pop it on my ironing mat. And there we have 2 sides of our block done. So I just need to continue on doing the exact same thing on these 2 sides. Continuing on in exactly the same way, I'm going to flip that over, fold my paper back so that I can trim to 1/4 of an inch past that fold. And then I'm going to grab my border and I'm going to come along, put my right sides together and just make sure that they're lined up nicely. Grab my pins. And then I'm going to come and do this seam. Now, you can just continue on by doing the little locking stitch or just a little bit past that end of that line towards it. But now that we've done those other 2 corners, we can actually come all the way out past the seam allowance and go all the way across for that one as well. Pull my pins out and flip it back and give it a good press. And now I can turn that over and fold back the next line that we're going to be sewing on. Trim that by 1/4 of an inch. And then I've got to get my matching blue for the top. I haven't mentioned this so far, but solids, there's no right or wrong side. So I'm not having to check that I've got the right side of my solid or anything. It makes it so much easier when you're doing foundation paper piecing. Okay, there's my triangle. Oops. And now we're going to come out and again from outside the seam allowance all the way across. Pins out and press back. So we've got the top done. We now need to be doing this bottom corner. Flip it over and I'm going to fold back to the first line that we're going to sew at. Trim to 1/4 of an inch. A nice little border strip. Right sides together. In. And then sew. Trim to the next seam line. As you can start to see, it becomes quite repetitive and you just get into a bit of a zone. I must say I much prefer not being interrupted when I'm doing foundation paper piecing so that I don't lose track of where I'm up to. But this one is fairly simple. Some of the more complex blocks and pieces can be a little bit more confusing, but this one is a nice simple one. So this is the last seam. Here's our last seam. And there we have our block. Now, obviously, it doesn't quite look how it's supposed to look, and that's because we still need to trim it. So we need to trim it to this outer dotted line, which is the seam allowance line. Last side. Get rid of our scraps. And there is a little bit of a thread. There is our finished block, and we now have 2 of them. Let me know in the comments section below if you've got any questions or queries, or feel free to come and make a comment on either mine or Make Modern Magazine's posts on socials, or you can join our Facebook Sew Along and Quilting group. There's a link in the caption below for that. So, well, I hope that demonstration has given you some confidence to go and have a go, to make a block, to test it out, to see whether you want to pin that centerpiece or glue it. Do you want to do the way I do it, which is trimming my seam allowance before I've added the next piece of fabric, or do you want to do it after? As I said, there are quite a few different ways to do things. It all ends up the same though. You have a lovely block. So go ahead, and we're doing 7 blocks this week. So you can either choose to do a particular row, grab the top one maybe and start doing that, or you could go and do perhaps one of each of the colours just to do something different. So I am on my way to doing my first row. So here's my little blue elephants. So I'll be back next week and we can talk about what we're going to be doing then. See you soon.